Well, our next topic is extraordinarily simple, not complex at all, and it's U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I can think of no one better to speak on this topic than Ambassador Dennis Ross. Yes. Ambassador Dennis Ross is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to returning to the Institute in 2011, he served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for the Central Region of the National Security Council. He also spent a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. And for over 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. Let's welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. I do this because I like to walk and talk. Partly it's because I teach, and I find that when I'm walking and talking, more things occur to me than might otherwise, and also because I got a Fitbit about a year ago, and I'm short of 10,000 steps right now, so I have to, if you see me speed up at certain points, you realize that I'm just trying to make up for what I haven't done yet. All right, so the U.S. policy in the Middle East. The good news, you're asking me only to talk about and explain U.S. policy in the Middle East and not American politics. I can actually explain, the Middle East, not just U.S. policy. I can explain the Middle East more easily than I can explain U.S. politics right now. So I'm going to limit myself to that. I want to start by saying something about the MOU. I'm assuming you have at some points today discussed the memorandum of understanding that was concluded last week between the United States and Israel. No? All right. Well, it's a 10-year agreement. We never before George W. Bush, we did annual assistance to Israel. George W. Bush and his administration made a decision as a result of conversations with Ehud Olmert, in which Olmert made the case it would be much better for Israel for its long-term planning if, in fact, there was a long period of time for assistance and not just an annual, basically, approach. So in 2007, a 10-year memorandum of understanding was concluded, which provided Israel, over 10 years, $30 billion in military assistance. What was concluded last week was a new 10-year memorandum of understanding to replace the one that was going to end next year. And it's been subject to criticism within Israel. Ehud Barak wrote a pretty tough article. Amos Yadlin, former head of military intelligence, also wrote a tough article along the same lines that had the Prime Minister of Israel not been opposed to and fought the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal with Iran, had he not done that, that Israel would have been able to get much more. We can get into a discussion of that if you want. In some ways, I would simply say $38 billion over 10 years is nothing to sneeze at, number one. Number two, $38 billion over 10 years during a time of budgetary concerns, during a time when there might be sequestration again, is a pretty significant manifestation of America's commitment not just to Israel, but it's a reminder that even when you have a president and a prime minister who, how shall I put this diplomatically, they don't get along. Even when you have that kind of a difficulty, and it's not the first time we've seen that between presidents and prime ministers, but even when you have that, nonetheless, you still see the basic underpinnings of the relationship. And the MOU from that standpoint, I think, is very important, not just because it shows bipartisanship, but because it shows that the grounding of the relationship, the nature of cooperation between the United States and Israel in the security area, and the American commitment to Israel's security is a pretty fundamental and robust one. I could talk more about that, but that's actually not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is what does the next president face in the Middle East? Because I want to talk about that with an eye towards what it says about some of our understandings of the region, but also where Israel fits into it. Now, I'm going to start by saying something that may surprise you. The next president is going to face a Middle East that none of his or her predecessors have faced, which is a pretty remarkable statement to make, because I can tell you, from Truman up until Obama, every single American president, every single one of those administrations, every one of them had at least one major conflict in the Middle East, one major crisis, one major event, in some cases more than one. And yet, the next president will face something that is much tougher. Because this is a region where there isn't just one conflict. This is a region that is characterized by unprecedented turmoil, conflict that is in many places unlimited, and it's something that is going to keep this region roiling for some period of time to come. I mean, look at the region. We have a war in Syria, basically a war between Assad and the opposition. The opposition is fighting both Assad and ISIS. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. 500,000 dead, 1 million wounded, 12 million people displaced out of a population of 23 million. It is extraordinary in terms of the scope of this conflict. But it's not the only conflict. In Iraq, there's a conflict going on. The Iraqi government is trying to take back the Sunni areas, the provinces like Anbar in particular. And think about the following. If, in fact, Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq, is liberated from ISIS control by the end of the Obama administration, and that's a possibility, it'll happen, but it'll happen only with the participation of leading Shia militias that are insisting they must be a part of it, and the three most important Shia militias that are armed by the Iranians, trained by the Iranians, financed by the Iranians, are all demanding they must be part of the liberation. And when they have been part of liberating places like Ramadi or Tikrit, a lot of the Sunni males have disappeared. And the next administration is going to face a circumstance where either upon its entry into office, Mosul may well have been liberated, or shortly after that, and because these militias are insisting they must play a role in the liberation, the likely aftermath is going to be a sectarian divide is deepened. And if they behave the way they have before, the sense of Sunni oppression will be deepened, and we will be recreating the circumstances that produced the kind of Sunni disaffection that led to the emergence of ISIS in the first place. That's a pretty daunting challenge. But again, that's only part of the story. In Yemen, we have a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Iranians think that they can bleed the Saudis there. The Saudis see themselves acting to ensure that Hezbollah isn't created on their doorstep. We have Egypt, which is engaged in a struggle with radical Islamists. And to put this in perspective, think about the following. Egypt has 90 million people. Were Egypt to become a failed or even a failing state, if you think what we're seeing in terms of a refugee crisis related to Syria, think what the implications would be of a collapse within Egypt. We have a huge stake in ensuring that doesn't happen, because the implications will make the Syrian conflict pale by comparison. 90 million population versus 23 million. Libya produced its own set of refugees. It has only 6 million people. Libya itself right now is more basically a number of militias and tribes and much less a state. And against that whole backdrop, you have Iran in the aftermath of the nuclear deal being, in a sense, even more aggressive in the region. Iran is using Shia militias, drawing on Shia militias that they recruit from as far away as Afghanistan. Today, most of those doing the fighting on the ground in Syria are Shia militias. It's not the Syrian military. The Syrian military, which was once 400,000 people, anybody have a guess as the size of the Syrian military today? Why don't you just take a guess? What do you think? 80,000 is the guess. Between 20 and 25,000. So most of those doing the fighting on the ground are the different Shia militias, Hezbollah and the others. So this is kind of the context in which the next president comes in, and the next president needs to be, A, cognizant of what's going on, That's just an analytical statement. You can draw your own political conclusions. I'm just laying things out analytically. That's because I'm fair and balanced. So the next president is going to face all this, and the next president is going to need partners in the region. And to have partners in the region, again, we have to understand something about their priorities. And we haven't done a great job of that. I'll give you an example of this. A few months ago, President Obama went to the GCC summit that was held in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And he went with the objective of trying to persuade these 6 Sunni states that are part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, with the objective of getting them to do more in the fight against ISIS, which is important because ultimately only Sunnis can discredit ISIS. It's important because you're going to need Sunni tribes and Sunni governance in the aftermath of defeating ISIS. That was my point on Mosul. If you don't have Sunnis to replace ISIS in Mosul, then you're going to end up sooner or later with son of ISIS. So you need the Sunnis with you. And it was logical that he was going to try to persuade them to play a larger role. But this was a mission that I described at the time as one that was doomed to fail. Unlike the title of my book, which is called Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli relationship from Truman to Obama, the reason his was doomed to fail was because he went them to persuade them to join us and do much more on ISIS, and their preoccupation is Iran. Their priority is Iran. It's not that they're indifferent to ISIS, but they see the Iran threat in existential terms. Now, President Obama, as I said, he didn't do real well in the meeting. One proof of it was the day after the summit was concluded, there was an article in Sharq al-Awsat, which is a regional Middle Eastern paper. Abdul Rahman al-Rashid, who is a leading journalist in it, actually is the managing director of Al Arabiya television network, is someone who is actually quite close to the Saudi leadership. And he wrote an article the day after in which he said, the President of the United States was asking us to acquiesce in what Iran is doing and accept it silently. And we won't do that. Again, what it highlights is not appreciating what the priorities are of the key leaderships out there. We don't have to accept their priorities, but we have to understand them if we want to shape policies that are more likely to be effective and more likely to affect them and influence them. Now, President Obama, it's the fact that he had that position, didn't fully appreciate the priorities. It's not unique to him. It's been something that reflects a reality in almost every administration from Truman until today. And until we learn some of the right lessons, until we understand, in fact, what shapes the priorities of Arab leaders, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. So what I want to do in my remaining time right now is I want to describe some of the assumptions that have been embedded in the psychology of the national security apparatus from Truman's time until today, and point out not only what's wrong about them, but also bring it up to today and explain how we should think a little differently. So there's 3 assumptions in particular that stand out, that have been very consistent in terms of enduring from Truman's time until today. And they do relate to Israel, as you'll see. One, if we were to distance ourselves from Israel, we would gain with the Arabs. Create space from Israel, criticize Israel, you'll gain with the Arabs. A corollary to that assumption was if you cooperate with the Israelis, you'll lose with the Arabs. And the third assumption was you can't change the American position in the region or the region itself unless you solve the Palestinian problem. These three assumptions have had a life of their own. Now, 5 administrations basically tried very hard to follow the logic of the first assumption, which was distance from Israel and you gain with the Arabs. The Eisenhower administration, the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, the first Bush administration, and the Obama administration. All consciously sought to distance from Israel. I'll give you a couple of examples. Eisenhower came in and was convinced that Truman had made his decision to recognize Israel only for domestic political reasons. He was determined to create a distance. One of the first things that was done, the Israelis were taking water from the Jordan River to try to create hydroelectric power. The Arabs complained, and Eisenhower cut off our loans to Israel at the time. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, took a trip early in the administration, the spring of 1953, and he went to Arab leaders and said, look, we are going to pursue our real interests in the region. Our real interests are with you. And he said, unlike the Democrats who depend upon the Jews, we don't. I mean, he went farther. Later on in the administration with Charles Luce, he said, we're going to try to have a policy, George Marshall tried to have a policy not run by the Jews. We're going to have one not run by the Jews. This is the Secretary of State. During the 1956 Suez War, not only did we author a Security Council resolution calling all countries to cut off ties to the Israelis and any assistance to the Israelis until they withdrew from the Sinai, but we also threatened the Israelis with expulsion from the UN. I mean, it's pretty tough stuff. Nixon, for the first 2 years of the administration, wouldn't allow Kissinger to work on this issue. This is the one issue he was excluded from. Why? Yeah, he was Jewish. By the way, it's not my interpretation. He said it. He wrote it. The great irony, of course, is when he did this because he wrote this, he said, we needed to reach out to the Arabs, and he thought that Kissinger couldn't do that. And of course, the great irony is, who was the one responsible for creating the relations with Egypt and Syria after the 1973 war? That would be Kissinger. But Nixon goes so far as to actually, he's the only president to suspend an arms sale to Israel, the Phantoms, F-4 Phantoms. He suspends the F-4 Phantoms to the Israelis because he's trying to curry favor with Nasser. Now, when he does this, he actually does this at a point when the Russians, the Soviets for the first time, were sending 10,000 of their military personnel, troops, to Egypt. That's the moment at which Nixon chooses to suspend the F-4s to the Israelis. And the whole point is distance, because he's hoping this will persuade Nasser to be more responsive to us. And of course, when he sent his Undersecretary of State there to see Nasser, Nasser demanded more, not less. And Obama, I won't go through each of the 5 administrations, but Obama, when he came in 2009, part of the reason, I say this in the Obama chapter, part of the reason that Obama stakes out the position that he does on settlements. It's okay to be critical of settlements, but Obama insisted on a complete settlement freeze, including natural growth, which gave all the Arabs and the Palestinians an excuse to do nothing until we delivered that. Good statecraft means you frame an objective in a way that you can actually achieve the objective. You don't frame an objective that gives everybody an excuse to do nothing until you deliver. But he did that, and I also say this in the chapter, he did this because he thought this was a good issue on which to distance from Israel because it didn't touch Israel's security. Because Obama, to be fair to him, has cared about Israel's security. And I say that as well. The point is, in these 5 administrations that made a conscious effort to distance from Israel, not one gained with the Arabs. Not one. Now I'll get into why in a minute, but I want to go through the other 2 assumptions. I said there was a corollary assumption. The corollary assumption was that, all right, if you cooperate with Israel, you lose with the Arabs. Now, the first American president to actually sell weapon systems to the Israelis was John Kennedy. John F. Kennedy. Well, there wasn't another John Kennedy president, but that's okay. You were just being complete. It was actually President Kennedy. It's also known as John F. Kennedy. But he was the first to provide a major weapon system to Israel, and it was a purely defensive weapon system called the Hawk anti-aircraft missile. It was a fixed defensive system. You could only use it for defense against aircraft that were attacking. But it triggered an unbelievable debate. He hadn't made the decision yet, but he was contemplating. It triggered an unbelievable debate within the administration. I can tell you, when I was going back and doing the research on this chapter, I went through all the cables that were coming in from our embassies at the time, and I can only describe them as the Chicken Little cables, because literally the sky was going to fall if we provided this to the Israelis. Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State. He said to the president, if you make this decision, if you approve this weapon system, it will set a terrible precedent and it will cause us grave damage with the Arabs. Now, as luck would have it, Dean Rusk was meeting the same day the news of the sale became public. He was meeting the real leader of Saudi Arabia, at that time Crown Prince Faisal, in New York at the opening of the UN General Assembly session. And when he went and he spoke to Faisal, what did he discover? I mean, after all, he says it was going to cause grave damage to our relations. Did he find that Faisal was saying, look, can't do business with you. You've just done something that we can't accept. You've just made our life impossible. So we're done. Is that what he found? It's a rhetorical question. Obviously, had he found that, I would have written a different book. Faisal doesn't raise the issue. What does Faisal raise? Faisal raises the coup in Yemen that Nasser is backing. And he says Nasser is trying to create a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula to threaten us, and what we need is we need American assurances and we need American weapons. So not only does he not raise it, but rather than causing grave damage, the Saudis actually want us closer to them. Now, it wasn't because we'd done this with the Israelis, but it's because they felt a threat from Nasser. Now, 1 week later, he saw President Kennedy in the Oval Office. And in that intervening week, he didn't have a change of heart. He came in, once again, he didn't raise this issue. What did he raise? He raised our outreach to Egypt. He said, your outreach to Egypt, your assistance to Egypt, and understand that when Kennedy came in, Kennedy made a conscious decision to try to reach out to Nasser. And the way he did it was by offering Nasser and Egypt economic assistance in the form of American wheat. By the time Faisal came, we were providing 2/3 of Egypt's bread supply. Okay, I'm getting a signal that I have to hurry up, because otherwise there's a trap door here, right? I disappear? Okay, all right. All right, I'll move quickly, okay? So when Faisal comes in, he complains about outreach to Egypt. The economic assistance, I said, we're providing 2/3 of Egypt's wheat, we're providing 2/3 of their bread supply. And he says, your economic assistance to Egypt is freeing up resources for them to cause trouble in the rest of the region, threaten all of your friends, change the balance of power. Your friends are losing, your interests are suffering, and you need to stop it, and we need more arms and we need more assurances. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Sound like maybe something you've heard more recently? Think it's what President Obama heard when he was at the GCC summit? Think it's what he's been hearing for the last 2 years? What was the big fear the Saudis and others had about the nuclear deal? It was going to end the sanctions against Iran, which was going to free up all these additional resources for them to cause even more trouble in the region. What do these examples tell you? Well, they tell you first and foremost, the priority of Arab leaders is their security and their survival. It's not that they love Israel, although I'm going to get to that in a second, that even that is changing. Not that they love Israel, but their view of Israel is changing. It's that their priority is what matters to them. Their priority is security and survival. They were never going to make their relationship with us contingent on what we did with Israel because they needed us for their security and their survival. So they never did make our relationship with Israel contingent in any way with their relations with us. The key, if we're going to understand the Middle East and we're going to try to affect the behavior of those that we're dealing with, is to understand those priorities. And that gets me to the last assumption, which is you can't transform America's position in the region, you can't transform the region itself unless you solve the Palestinian issue. Now you're looking at somebody who spent the last 30 years trying to solve the Palestinian issue. But it wasn't because I thought this was going to transform the region. It's because I knew that it was important ultimately for Israelis and Palestinians alike. It's because I know that if Israel, and this is Zionism 3.0, I knew that if Israel was going to be true to its Zionist ethic, it must remain a Jewish democratic state. And I understood that the way to fulfill its promise was to settle this conflict, but also it was the only way for Palestinians to have their national aspirations fulfilled as well. Did I think that it could have some additional benefit? Of course. Did I think that it was going to transform the region? No. I thought you could take an intractable conflict and show even that could be settled. And these are the reasons to try to resolve it. Now, there is something that is happening in the region today. I said the Arabs don't love the Israelis. They still don't love the Israelis. In 1981, when Alexander Haig was the Secretary of State, he came in and he said the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Soviet threat created a strategic consensus in the region between the Arabs and Israelis. He thought it did. At the time, it didn't. But today, it does exist. Israel's relationship with the Sunni Arab states is unprecedented. Most of it is below the radar screen because the Palestinian issue keeps it below the radar screen. But it doesn't make the cooperation that's below the radar screen any less real. The Gulf states and Egypt and Jordan, the Gulf states look at Israel as a bulwark against Iran. Egypt and Jordan look at it as a bulwark against the radical Islamists. So there is a strategic convergence. It creates a potential for the next administration. It's an asset that can be built on to try to stabilize the state system, to counter the Iranian use of Shia militias, to also even think about how you might be able to transform the current stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians. Palestinians right now are too weak, too divided, too consumed by the prospect of succession, leadership succession, too driven by their own sense of grievance and injustice to think that negotiations are anything but a concession. They don't want to go into negotiations, and even if they were in negotiations, they couldn't make any concessions. They need an Arab umbrella, not to take their place, but to help assume responsibility for any adjustment of their positions. Israel, too, needs an Arab umbrella because the body politic in Israel today doesn't believe you get anything if you give concessions to the Palestinians. But if you get something from the Arabs, that might justify it. There is, as a result, potentially something you can use in this new landscape. Yes, this is a very confused, yes, this is a region characterized by turmoil. Yes, the state system is being challenged in a number of places, and a country like Syria may never be put back together again. But there is something taking place at the same time. Our ability to sort of reestablish trust and credibility with both the Sunni Arabs and with Israel gives us something to work with, not only to affect the strategic landscape in the region and to create an incentive for the Iranians to stop what they're doing. You know, the logic of what drove, and I'll wrap up. I know you've already sent that. I'm actually going to wrap up right now. Contrary to some, I actually pay attention to these little signs. The logic of what we did in the first term of the Obama administration vis-a-vis Iran was to raise the cost to them of what they were doing on their nuclear program, but to leave them a way out. They said they would never negotiate on their nuclear program as long as they were under sanction. And we doubled down on the sanctions, and they negotiated. We can debate whether we could have negotiated better. It's a different issue. But they said they wouldn't negotiate as long as they were under sanctions. We made the sanctions worse, and they negotiated because the price was too high. We need to follow the same logic in the region. We need to raise the price to them of what they're doing when they try to destabilize states. The Iranians are a part of the region. They have 80 million people. But they can't be a part of the region in any kind of normal sense as long as they threaten all their neighbors. So we need to make it clear, working with these natural partners, that there's a price to be paid. Once we do that, the potential to change even Iranian behavior goes up. And if we're able to do that in a way that is also credible to Arabs and Israelis alike, we may be able to translate that also into something having to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last point. One of the reasons I wrote a book called Doomed to Succeed about the U.S.-Israeli relationship is not that I felt we could afford to be complacent, but because I saw a relationship that started at a very low ebb, evolved over time, and basically has been built to the point where it is really rooted in something more fundamental. At a time when the region is characterized by turmoil, terrible turmoil, and will be for the next 10 to 20 years at least, this is not the point at which any administration is going to say, gee, we need to create a problem with Israel. Israel's the one pillar we have that you can count on. Whatever its problems, it's far more capable of coping with those problems than most other states in the region. Israel's inherent stability is something that, if it didn't exist, we would want to create because we would see it benefiting us in a region where the turmoil is great and where the Las Vegas rules don't apply. Whatever takes place in the Middle East, it never stays in the Middle East. And if you had any doubts about that, just look at Syria. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Ross. We have had the pleasure of knowing each other for many years. I know you've worked with administrations all the way back to Bush 1. And so I'm curious, Tal Becker of the Shalom Hartman Institute has said before that America will always be criticized for our roles in the Middle East, either for doing too much or too little. I'm curious, with whatever presidential candidate becomes the next president of the United States, which trap we will fall into in your estimation? Well,
look, I think that there's a danger now that we will continue a pattern and certainly a perception that we will do too little. Look, in Iraq, we did way too much. We replaced the regime. We had no plan for what was going to take its place. We produced the vacuum. Vacuums in the Middle East are always filled by the worst possible forces. In Syria, our hesitancy to do anything at all contributed to the vacuum, and it got filled by the worst forces. I'm afraid there's a mood within the American public to say, gee, the Middle East is such a mess that we shouldn't be involved in it at all. But as I said, when you do way too little, you end up with what you see in Syria. And we will see more of that. And we really can't afford to be in a position where, we see bigger problems that begin to emerge, which, as I said, won't stay in the Middle East, but they will visit us and the rest of the world as well. So I'm hoping that the next administration, and I believe one of those who are running, I have a fair degree of confidence, that we would remain engaged, not in a way that doesn't make sense, because this gets to, in a sense, what Tala is saying, we're looking for the Goldilocks solution, right? We're not going to do too much, we're not going to do too little, we're going to do what's just right.
Exactly.
But it is possible to be smarter about what we do if we understand what's at stake for us, if we understand how to work with others in the region, if we understand that we can do things and we also require our partners to do things at the same time. I believe that having an American president who understands the importance of being engaged in the region, the importance of not allowing vacuums to emerge, understands the value of allies, understands if you raise questions about whether the U.S. is a reliable ally, then you won't have any allies. And I'm hopeful that the next administration will operate in a way that will follow the Goldilocks solution for the Middle East.
And I think we're all hopeful as well. I'm also hopeful understanding how, and you put this in a previous book, about this linkage argument that you just debunked, the three pieces of the linkage argument. Do you believe that the next administration, one or the other, will buy into the linkage argument, will understand that there is no validity in that?
I've argued against it for a long time. I've lived and fought this from inside different administrations, having been a part of 5 administrations. I really do think that the region today is so obviously disproving linkage. What's the logic of linkage is what I was describing, that third assumption, that the core of the problem in the Middle East is the Palestinian problem. Unless you solve it, you can't solve the Middle East's problems. Well, if tomorrow, since this is a JCC, and the Moshiach were to arrive, you know, it wouldn't stop what's going on in Syria. It wouldn't change what's happening in Iraq. It wouldn't stop Yemen. It wouldn't stop what's going on in Egypt. It wouldn't change what's going on in Libya. It's not that it wouldn't be of value, but it wouldn't affect any of those, all those conflicts. So many of those conflicts are they're not just a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, although some of them are, but it's also a struggle over identity. It's a struggle over who's going to define identity. It's a struggle between radical Islamists, Sunni and Shia, against each other. It's a struggle between radical Islamists and non-Islamists. And how that comes out is very much in our interest. So, you know, it's pretty clear that the reality of the Middle East has never been so clear that the idea of linkage doesn't make a whole lot of sense, though certain ideas just die very hard.
It's been often said that if there were a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow, it would not change the way women were treated in different parts of the Middle East. So I want to ask you if you believe in the Sam Huntington model of a clash of civilizations, if we're in that mode right now. It often feels like it.
I think there's a clash within a civilization. Islam has never really had its own reformation, and there's a struggle going on right now for the heart and soul of Islam. And I just returned from a trip to Saudi Arabia that was remarkable because the Saudis historically have funded the madrasas around the world, and yet now you have a leadership that is so determined to modernize and reform Saudi Arabia that their ideology is development. They're not about the export of Wahhabism. They're about trying to create their own successful model. That could be quite transformative because think about it, we have never had a successful model of Arab politics, meaning where an Arab leadership has been able to transform their society successfully and without terrible upheaval. What we have had in the Middle East is a series of, in a sense, those who were trying to restore greatness lost. I've often said about the Middle East and the Arab world in particular that Islam was the height of civilization and culture in the 10th century. And it spread throughout the world. You know, they were the leading scholars in arithmetic, in astronomy, in science generally, in the letters and literature. Everywhere you look, this was sort of the cutting edge. And there has been this sense of greatness lost that has pervaded the Middle East. Nasser in the 1950s wrote a book called Philosophy of the Revolution, in which he talked about a role in search of a hero. He was going to be the hero. He was going to restore their dignity and their greatness and bring the Middle East back to a place of prominence internationally. He failed. His successors who tried the same thing, whether it was Gaddafi tried to be a pretender for that, then Saddam Hussein. The Iranians are trying that. The ISIS is trying that. They all fail because they actually don't have a real, they don't really have a positive approach or a positive message for development. So if you could actually produce a successful model of development and progress were seen, this then could actually be transformative in the Middle East and in a positive way.
So you have laid out an idea that is probably going to take many, many years to get there. You have been a soldier in this fight for 30 years. There are a lot of folks in this audience who are maybe suffering from a little bit of conflict fatigue, and the folks who actually are not here are the ones who probably opted out. What advice would you have for this crew to just kind of buckle down and help them understand that we still have a role to play?
Well, I'd start by saying, as I said, because the Las Vegas rules don't apply, you know, what happens in the Middle East is going to express itself on the outside. You know, you see it with Syria. You know, the Syrian conflict as it evolved with the refugee crisis is what produced Brexit. It's what has shaken the underpinnings of the foundations of the EU. The Europeans have been our foremost partners internationally. When you shake these kinds of international institutions that are also important to us, we have a lot to lose. So we have a stake. We have a stake in what happens for the better in the Middle East, and also we have a stake in trying to prevent the worst. So yes, it's easy to feel a fatigue, but one of the things I was trying to say here, and one of the things I was trying to show in the book, if we really learn the lessons from the past, if we really understand what the priorities are, we can shape a more effective policy. It's not reading correctly what matters to those in the region has, in many ways, contributed to some of the setbacks that we've had, and it's those setbacks that have created a sense that, gee, this is such a mess, nothing can be done.
Last question I want to ask, and then I want to ask if anyone in the audience has questions through Evenium. There's a famous story about Henry Kissinger speaking to Golda Meir and talking about how he's the Secretary of State first, then an American, and then a Jew. And Golda Meir says, that's fine. In Israel, we go from right to left. So my question for you is, how has your Jewishness impacted your role in the last several administrations vis-a-vis the Middle East?
It's an interesting question. You know, I've often been asked the question, well, sort of, how do the Arabs deal with you? And the fact is, they always sort of saw me as representing the United States, either the President or Secretary of State. You know, those who wanted to criticize me would always cite my Jewishness. But that happened to be true not just for people in the Middle East, but also outside the Middle East, including here. There were times when I was criticized, including leaks out of this administration, that raised a kind of dual loyalty specter. You know, my attitude was, I know who I am. I don't apologize for who I am. And, you know, I don't think any of us should. We're dealing, you know, in a world where we shouldn't take anything for granted, but it's precisely because we shouldn't take anything for granted that we should be prepared to stand up for who we are. And when we see things that are wrong, especially when you look at something like the BDS movement, which is actually about no Israel. It's not about occupation, it's about no Israel. When you see delegitimization efforts, delegitimization of Israel is also an effort to delegitimize Jews. It's a way of saying the Jewish people don't have a right to a state of their own, notwithstanding what history tells us. You know, I co-chair something called the Jewish People Planning Institute in Jerusalem. We do an annual assessment about the state of the Jewish people and the relationship of Israel to the diaspora. And every year, one of the things I do is I do the geopolitics. Year to year, you evaluate how things are going. And I said at one point, you know, look, I want Israel to adopt policies that are consistent with what the Prime Minister has identified as his policy, which is 2 states for 2 peoples. So I said, you know, you need to make your settlement policy consistent with a 2-state outcome. Because that's, if you have 2 states for 2 peoples, then your settlement policy. So build in the blocks. Don't build the east security barrier. Don't build in what you think would be the Palestinian state. I said, you know, and if you do that, you'll take away the veil that BDS hides behind. Because they want to focus on settlements and occupation, so no one really focuses on what their real purpose is. And I said, you know, I hope you'll do this because I think it's right for you and it would help in this larger struggle. But people like me are going to fight delegitimization anyway. There was never, for those who've studied Jewish history for real, there was never a golden period for the Jews, because even those so-called golden periods like in Spain, they were always vulnerable at any minute. Everything could be taken away at any minute. So today is the golden age for the Jews, because there isn't Israel. And the idea that we should be silent in the face of efforts to delegitimize it, it's like you're trying to delegitimize who we are.
Amen to that. Thank you. I think we might have time for a question from Evenium, which is, what about Turkey? Why does the U.S. keep supporting an Erdogan dictatorial regime which backs ISIS, oil, weapons, fighters, etc.?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's a very complicated relationship. Turkey is a member of NATO. You know, for us to carry out bombing against ISIS, we do it from the air base in Incirlik in Turkey. You know, one of the things we have to do with Turkey is obviously try to find a way to ensure that what should be a mutual interest in going after ISIS, and which we are now seeing the Turks are doing much more against it because they've been much more the victim of it. But there's a tension here because the Turks tend to view the YPG, which is a Kurdish group in northern Syria that we were backing because we saw them as being the most effective fighters in Syria against ISIS. The Turks see them as connected to the PKK, and they're fighting a war with the PKK in Turkey. One of the things we should do is see if there's a way with Turkey to go back to, there was a diplomatic process with the PKK that the Turks were engaged in, which stopped about a year ago. One of the ways to try to reconcile the tension between objectives here is to see if we can reestablish such a diplomatic process again. You know, when you have an ally who has a different objective or a different priority, it's obviously part of what I was saying about most of the Arab leaderships, you need to understand what the source of that is and then try to address it, see if there's a way to deal with it in a way that makes sense for both of us. Turkey is going to be complicated for a long time to come. The attempted coup on July 15th was a national trauma. In Turkey, it unites all Turks, left to right, secular, Islamists, they're all united. They all think that Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania, is here because we allow it. And so we will have, we will have to work hard in this relationship because there are interests we have, there are interests that we share with them, and there are obviously areas where we have disagreements. One way to try to affect the behavior of your allies is to show you get the things that concern them. When you do that, then you can usually put yourself in a position where you can ask something of them.
Thank you, Ambassador Ross. We appreciate your time.